Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining, and other people are welcome to join in as they can. My name is Mary Jane Parmentier, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first lecture of the Center for Maghreb Studies lecture series. I'm currently the interim director of the center, and I see that our director, Shukil Hamel, is here. So nice to see you. He is on sabbatical. And I would like to start with an acknowledgement on behalf of the Center for Maghreb Studies that we're located on the ancestral lands of indigenous nations, and we thank the native communities of the Salt River Valley, including the Akamal Odom and the Peepash nations, who have inhabited this place for centuries and whose stewardship of the land and waterways allows us to be here today. Also want to mention that we have a Twitter handle. It's ASU_CMS, which is a great way to follow what the center is doing. We'll have that placed in the chat in a minute so you can see. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paraska Tolan-Szkilnik, from Suffolk University in Boston. And Paraska is also, we're so excited, a new member of our executive committee here at the Center for Maghreb Studies. And we're so delighted for her to be presenting her work entitled Maghreb Noir. And I will give you the floor, Paraska. She'll present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Jane. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Skylar and Mary Jane for putting this together. And thank you all for being here and for attending one more Zoom event. So today I'm going to give you a talk, or I'm going to talk about my first book project, which is actually coming out in July of next year with Stanford University Press. Let me share my screen so you can see that, let's see. Oops, here it is. So this is, we actually just, the cover, the editors and I just agreed on a cover, which you see here on the slide, which is sort of a homage to William Klein's film on the Pan-African Festival of Algiers, which I'll be telling you more about in my presentation today, the festival, not the film. But so yeah, so we just came up with a cover, which you see here. So on a blistering summer day in July 1969, a car packed with Moroccan poets and painters, including the three men you see here on the screen, writer Tahar Benjeloun, poet Abdellatif Laabi, and militant Abraham Serfati, drove into Algiers for the aforementioned Pan-African Festival of Algiers, which sometimes we call colloquially the PANAF. At the festival, these young Moroccans joined thousands of militant artists from across the African continent, Europe and Asia, and the Americas. The hotels were overflowing with official delegations. So these sort of non-official attendees, like these three men, had to sleep in schools and gymnasiums or even under bridges, as some confessed to me. During the PANAF, Tahar Benjeloun, who you saw here in the middle, had the opportunity to interview Ousmane Sembène, the Senegalese film director. To Benjeloun, Sembène's 1968 movie, Le Mandat, was the African continent's first cinematic manifesto because it balked at the harsh realities of life under post-colonial authoritarian regimes. So of course, Tahar Benjeloun was very eager to meet Ousmane Sembène. And when he met him, he asked Sembène, how should African cinema define itself in contrast with Western culture? Sembène responded categorically, let us not talk about the West, let's talk about us. The conversation then turned to the role of the artist in post-colonial Africa. Sembène said, for me, he, the artist, is a politician. He is a man completely engaged in perpetual dissent. His role is to be a militant, a fighter. For Sembène, there was only one valid form of art in post-colonial Africa, and that was militant art, dissenting art. Benjeloun and Sembène were debating the role of African artists amid one of the biggest celebrations of revolutionary culture on the African continent, the Pan-African Festival of Algiers. The festival was funded by the Algerian state and by the Organization of African Unity, and it consecrated political art through a series of parades, concerts, poetry readings, and visual art exhibits. The pictures you see here on the screen, the first one on your left is a picture from the opening parade for the festival in the streets of Algiers. The second one is a picture of Nina Simone performing at the Pan-African Festival of Algiers. I don't think this is where she performed, this picture is actually when she performed Ne Me Quitte Pas, because because this actually the first time she performs the song Ne Me Quitte Pas. But I feel like her position is too enthusiastic for such a sad song, but who knows. The other one is the poster for the festival, and the third one on the right is a picture of Aldridge Cleaver and Kathleen Cleaver walking through the streets of Algiers during the Pan-African Festival. The festival, so I said, consecrated political art. One of the Pan-African Festival's pamphlets read, "The Occidental idea of culture has gone a long way and has favored a thesis according to which culture is a luxury of the overdeveloped." The artists of the Panaf aimed to overthrow this intolerable separation, they thought, between art and life. Culture in post-colonial Africa, claimed the Algerian president Houari Boumediene in the Panaf's opening speech, was a crucial weapon in the struggle for liberation. In the first few years of independence, of post-independence, the Algerian National Liberation Front, the FLN, one of several nationalist organizations that had fought for Algeria's independence from France, appropriated the revolution the Algerian people had led against the colonial powers. The FLN created an independence narrative that glorified the party's leaders as anti-colonial heroes and celebrated them through state-commissioned art, like the one put in display at the Pan-African Festival. Monopolizing post-colonial cultural production, the Algerian government propagated the idea of freedom as a collective Pan-African liberation from foreign rule. Pan-Africanism appealed to the Algerian government because, as it was organized around a loose federation of African states, it didn't undermine the FLN's authority. Furthermore, by focusing on Pan-Africanism as a state ideology, Algerian leaders hoped that anti-colonial agitators would continue to channel their anger outwards towards the former colonial powers and the imperialism of the Soviet Union and the United States, rather than inwards towards their increasingly authoritarian leaders. So given the publicized goal of the Pan-African Festival, Tahar Benjeloun and Ousmane Sembène could have felt right at home in these boisterous streets of 1969 Algiers in the celebration of revolutionary art. But Benjeloun and Sembène and many of their peers were not fooled by the Algerian government's attempt at controlling the Pan-African conversation, for they understood that freedom extended well beyond the post-colonial state's infrastructures. They actually viewed the festival as co-opting the power and potential of revolutionary art, transforming it into a state project that served to uphold a corrupt post-colonial government. And so outside the major state-sponsored events like the Pan-African Festival, Benjeloun, Sembène, and their peers met around kitchen tables, in dim bars, and in the leafy cafes of the Algerian capital to talk about what they thought the role of the artist was in post-colonial Africa. Like Sembène, they concluded that the role of the artist was to dissent. And the decades or so after independence, two very different forms of Pan-Africanism collided in the Maghreb. The first was a state-level project, staged for all to see at events like the Panaf, staged at events like you see in front of your eyes. The other was a state-skeptical project that was led by a fluctuating group of militant artists who created a Pan-African culture dissenting both from the enduring legacies of European colonialism and from the authoritarianism of the post-colonial states. But because the Maghrebi government's largely successful attempt at monopolizing Pan-African culture, we have to look outside the state, its people, and its infrastructures to find that dissenting Pan-Africanism in alternative sites of political engagement, such as the radio airwaves, the pages magazines, festival gatherings, and the intimate spaces of living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms. So Maghreb Noir tunes in on these conversations of dissent between militant artists of what I have named the Maghreb generation, because of the central role that the Maghreb played in their political and artistic awakening and evolution. The capital cities of the Maghreb, Rabat, Algiers, Tunis, were points of convergence for these militant artists, spaces to write, to paint, to print zines, to film, to train militarily, to laugh, to make love, and to debate the future of postcolonial Africa. Maghreb Noir is the story of the Maghreb's alternative spaces of Pan-African engagement and of the militant artists who inhabited these spaces, a few of whom you see on the screen right now. It's important to note that many of these militant artists were imprisoned, tortured, or even killed for their role in creating a culture of dissenting Pan-Africanism. For many, their links to the Maghreb and the political and artistic work they did there has long been forgotten. The numerous migratory crises that Europe has faced in the past 10 years have made the Maghreb the epicenter of many of Europe's immigration anxieties. Indeed, the Maghreb has become, for many Africans, an entryway into Europe, a place of passage, a liminal space in which to wait for visas or boats. In the Maghreb, too, the increase in the Black and migrant population have revived many debates on the Maghreb's relationship to the rest of the continent. The 2011 Tunisian revolution cast a spotlight on the condition of Black Tunisians. To understand the demands of Black Maghrebis and the lived realities of Black migrants in the Maghreb, I think it is imperative to write the history of the relations between the Maghreb and the rest of the continent. Despite its location on the Mediterranean and its long history as a crossroads between the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the Maghreb has remained marginal to the historiographies of all those regions. Stories about Pan-Africanism also, and the Black Atlantic, also rarely include North Africa. And this despite the fact that many Black American writers, intellectuals, and artists not only reflected on the plight of North Africans in Europe, but also traveled to North Africa in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. American performer Josephine Baker, adored internationally by both a Black and white audience, spent much of World War II leading the French resistance efforts from Morocco and providing Moroccan passports to Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. Here she is giving a benefit concert for orphans in Casablanca. Black American writers James Baldwin, Jessie Fawcett, Claude McKay, and William Gardner Smith, while residing in Paris, traveled to the Maghreb and expressed their solidarities with the Algerian struggle for independence. In 1972, James Baldwin wrote, "He, the Algerian, and his brothers were in fact being murdered by my hosts, the French. And Algeria, after all, is a part of Africa. And France, after all, is a part of Europe. The Algerian and I were both alike, victims of this history. And I was still a part of Africa, even though I had been carried out of it nearly 400 years before." Maghreb Noir turns to the role that the Maghreb played in the development of a post-colonial Pan-Africanism. First, I argue that the Maghreb generation's definition of Blackness was political rather than racial. With their capacious understanding of Blackness, the members of the Maghreb generation included all colonized, formerly colonized, or otherwise marginalized peoples from across the globe within their Pan-African community. Second, because the ideas of Pan-Africanism were no longer limited exclusively to Black people, a multitude of Black, Arab, white, and Amazigh militants living in the Maghreb during the 50s, 60s, and 70s took up the project of Pan-Africanism and transformed it into a multilingual, multiracial, militant artistic project. Indeed, the encounters in North Africa between Black and Maghrebi artists challenged the foundations on which many believed Pan-African solidarities were based. Before traveling to the Maghreb, people like Angolan Mario de Andrade, Angolan poet Mario de Andrade, Haitian poet René de Pestre, and American Ted Jones, also a beat poet, jazz poet, articulated their ideas along the lines of racial and national solidarity. They were inspired by the political Pan-Africanism of their forefathers who had fought to free African people through anti-colonial struggles and a series of Pan-African congresses on the European continent. They were stirred by the poetry of the Negritude movement. They read the works of Léopold Sédar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Léon Damas, and throughout the 1950s, they searched for their own Blackness. Often this involved the pursuit of a nationally specific negritude, an Angolan, a Haitian, or an American Black identity. They published their own negritude poetry, like this Quaderno, Poesia Negra de Expressão Portuguesa, which Mario de Andrade and Francisco Tenero published in 1953. But as the 1950s became the 1960s, the leaders of these new Black nations became increasingly autocratic. The negritude rendered policy of Senghor, of Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, and Pape Doc Duvalier in Haiti became repulsive to the members of the Maghreb generation. As De Pestre, Jones, and Andrade traveled in the Maghreb, they met Maghrebi poets such as Moroccan poet Abdellatif Lahabi and Algerian poet Jean Senac, who were equally disenchanted with the new leaders of the post-colonial world. From Algiers, Rabat, and Tunis, they started declaring in quasi-unison that rigid racial solidarity was obsolete. In 1966, De Pestre published an essay in the Moroccan literary journal Souffle, arguing that, and I quote, separated from the historical context of the revolution in the Third World, negritude became an unacceptable Black Zionism, which kept the Black people away from their duty to do the revolution. Ted Jones, the American beat poet I was telling you about before, who by 1966 had been living in the Maghreb for 6 years, in between Timbuktu and Tangiers, wrote to his friend poet André Breton that he would not go to Dakar for what he called Senghor's Mer de Noir, Senghor's Black Shit, otherwise known as the 1966 First World Festival of Black Arts in Dakar, because he did not want to participate in an event where artists and poets, and I quote again, would be held up financially by Senghor's Black bourgeoisie gangsters, assisted by the USA fat Black pussycat officials. He boycotted Dakar in his own secret way, he continued, by crossing the Sahara to Oran, Algeria, so by being in the Maghreb. This isn't to say that the language of race, of course, was absent from the discourse of post-colonial Pan-Africanism. After all, members of the Maghreb generation were still careful to distinguish themselves from those they called the white Europeans and Americans, from the white Europeans and Americans. They were eager not to be confused with those that they called the white poets, beatniks, hippies, or hairy marijuana dealers of Paris and San Francisco. They made clear that they weren't just marchers of war and peace, but that their intention was not to beat, as they said, the tam-tams of victory, or to lull in the comforts of folklore and exoticism, but rather, as Abdellatif Lahabi put it, to dynamite the rotten halls of the old humanisms. The militant artists of the Maghreb generation pushed beyond the global color line imposed by the former colonial powers, and in so doing, they discursively colored all colonized and formerly colonized people, all those who resisted neo-colonialism and authoritarianism. The Pan-African community hence extended beyond the boundaries of the continent, or even of the diaspora, to all those who sought a third way between the former colonial powers and the new post-colonial states. At the center of that community was the African continent. So my book expands the Black internationalism, the horizons of Black internationalism, which we've already seen in books on Black London or Black Paris or Black New York. And I introduce a new hub of Black thought. After Black London, Black Paris, I present to you Black Tunis, Black Rabat, and Black Algiers, the cities that constituted the Maghreb Noir. Maghreb Noir moves chronologically and geographically from late 1950s Rabat through late 1960s Algiers and to early 1970s Tunis. Each chapter focuses on a specific case study of a specific transnational encounter between militant artists of the Maghreb generation. Beginning in Morocco, the first chapter follows the peregrinations of a group of Luso-African poets and militants from Lisbon to Paris to Rabat. Starting in the 1950s, these young militant artists use Rabat as a home base for anti-colonial activism in the Portuguese colonies. Morocco served as a liberated space on the African continent, where they could imagine what one could be in the wake of empire. There, they met young Moroccan writers who were haunted by similar concerns over their role in the post-colonial world. Among them, Moroccan poet Abdellatif Lahabi, founder of the Moroccan literary journal Souffle. The second chapter of the book centers on the editorial group of Souffle. Over the course of its 7 years, from 1966 to 1973, Souffle took off from a small Moroccan literary journal to a paper caucus through which writers from across the African continent and the diaspora called for an African cultural revolution. The Maghreb Noir's third and fourth chapters turn to Algeria's role in shaping Pan-African thought. By the mid-1960s, Algiers was teeming with revolutionaries from across Africa, the Americas, and Asia. leading famously the militant Amilcar Cabral to call Algiers the Mecca of revolutionaries. But not all in Algiers were enthusiastic supporters of the Algerian government's bid for Pan-African leadership. Chapter 3 gives voice to the poets and artists from Algeria and beyond, who viewed the festival as a facade erected to conceal the decaying ideas that had once sustained the Algerian revolution. Chapter 4 offers a window into the carnal underbelly of Algiers' status as the Mecca of revolution by looking at sexual and romantic interactions between artists of the Maghreb generation during the Pan-African Festival in 1969. And finally, chapter 5 turns to Tunisia's attempts to match Moroccan and Algerian Pan-African leadership. The Tunisian Cultural Ministry was determined to become a key player in the African cultural scene, and they created the Journées Cinématographiques de Carthage, a biennale film festival in 1966. Under the joint leadership of Tunisian intellectual Tahar Sheria and Senegalese novelist and director Ousmane Sembène, the biennale transcended the Tunisian state's original intent and actually became a hub for members of the Maghreb generation to continue creating a Pan-Africanism of descent from the same Pan-Africanism. Many of the same characters who had first been in Rabat, then Algiers, moved to Tunis. So Maghreb Noir is the story of a group of men and women who met in the Maghreb during the 1960s and 70s and attempted to create a community that overcame racial barriers and struggled for more than just territorial decolonization, for freedom of thought, for sexual freedom, and for freedom beyond the nation state. Through radio shows, dinner parties, and public poetry readings, the militant artists of the Maghreb generation created a community that transcended the official channels of the Pan-African Festival and other such Maghrebi state-led Pan-African projects. I came to this project by excavating the voices of the Maghreb generation from 25 official and unofficial archives across 6 countries. You'll see the unofficial archives are the ones that are personal archives, essentially from donated very generously by my interviewees. I interviewed 33 people for this project, whose names you'll see on the screen now. So Maghreb Noir moves away from interrogating the persistence of the colonial discourse and North-South relationships, and instead focuses on conversations occurring on the ground between members of the Maghreb generation about the future of the post-colonial world. The dreams of the transnational Pan-African project that motivated the men and women of the Maghreb generation have since collapsed, unfortunately, for the most part. Rabat, Algiers, and Tunis have each lost their status as havens for the Maghreb generation. As the 1970s churned into the 1980s, freedom of political and artistic expression was gradually crushed under the iron fist of the new post-colonial states of Hassan II in Morocco, Houari Boumediene in Algeria, and Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia. The Soviets and Americans waged proxy wars in Angola and Mozambique and across the African continent, taking advantages of divisions between various factions, all vying for power in these newly liberated states. These conflicts stymied most hopes of Pan-African unity. With the end of the Cold War, capitalism won the battle of ideologies, and both Morocco and Tunisia became playgrounds for wealthy European tourists and retirees, while Algeria sunk into a decade-long civil war that has left Algerians reeling to this day, and its artists in particular looking for opportunities outside the country. So the threat that the members of the Maghreb generation pose to their Maghrebi governments has mostly died out. In fact, in the past couple of decades, many Pan-African revolutionaries from the 1960s have been resuscitated from collective amnesia by the very governments that imprisoned, tortured, and even murdered them. When I was in Rabat in February 2018, the Royal Library hosted a conference on Morocco's assistance to the former Portuguese colonies in Southern Africa under the high patronage of King Mohammed VI. In Morocco, souffle anfas is no longer a taboo. Until the late 1990s, it was almost impossible to find copies of the journal, but from 1997 to 2004, 2 American professors digitized souffle anfas, and the Moroccan Royal Library uploaded it to their website in 2010. The journal has now entered the pantheon of Moroccan national culture and is being reclaimed by the heir, King Mohammed VI, to the Moroccan government that imprisoned and tortured the journal's members. When I traveled to Tunis in November 2018 for the 29th edition of the Journées Cinématographiques de Carthage, the opening speeches and remarks all underscored the deep friendship between the Tunisian state and liberation movements from across Africa. Posters of Soleil Haut and Zambi Zanga were framed for all to see in the new and gigantic Cité de la Culture in downtown Tunis. Revolutionaries are now sexy. The Maghrebi's government's renewed interest in the post-colonial Pan-Africanism has helped retrieve valuable archival documents. When in 2009, the Algerian government organized a second Pan-African festival, pamphlets from the 1969 iteration were dug up and reprinted. In William Klein's movie, which 1969 documentary that I was telling you about earlier, once very difficult to find, was restored with the help of the European TV channel Arte. But the lack of historical research on the lives and works of the militant artists of the Maghreb generation has left a vacuum that the Maghrebi governments move happily to fill. In 2018, El-Mustafa El-Kitri, the Moroccan High Commissioner to the former members of the Resistance and the Liberation Army, opened the Morocco Africa Conference with a speech on the importance of shared memory. We must not miss a chance to stay and to repeat a certain number of truths about our collective memory and about Morocco's efforts for the liberation of these African countries under Portuguese colonialism, stressed El-Kitri. El-Kitri clearly stated the Moroccan government's interest in projecting a uniform conception of the past that could serve a political point. To El-Kitri, historical research was important in so much as it allowed the Moroccan government to mine the past for evidence of Morocco's positive influence on other African countries. In other words, to El-Kitri, the Moroccan government's goal in resuscitating this shared memory should not be curiosity or the desire to question certain aspects of Moroccan history, but rather to serve the Moroccan government's political needs in the present. Never did El-Kitri mention tensions between the Luso-African militants in Rabat and the Moroccan government. On the contrary, El-Kitri lauded Moroccan King Hassan II for his total acceptance of all the Luso-Africans, never once pointing to the reason that these militant artists eventually deserted Morocco. The problem with leaving, the Pan-African archives of the post-colonial Maghreb in the hands of government officials is that it will undoubtedly obscure the story of descent, not against the ideas of Pan-Africanism, but against the post-colonial state's co-optation of the movement. As I demonstrate throughout my book, while militant artists of the Maghreb generation use the state's Pan-African celebrations as points of convergence to meet and to talk, they did not espouse the authoritarian tendencies of these states. In the margins of state-sponsored events, like the Pan-African Festival or the Journées Cinématographiques de Carthage in Tunisia, they created their own Pan-Africanism of dissent. The archives of the Maghreb generation are difficult to find. After all, the Maghrebi states didn't have an interest in conserving these traces of dissent. Letters, poems, and drawings have disappeared. The Maghrebi governments have confiscated and destroyed reels of films, zines, and manifestos. Many of the militant artists of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s are aging, losing their memories, or are dead. Marcelino dos Santos died on February 10th, 2020. Marcelino dos Santos, who you see here on the left. Sarah Maldoror, whom I interviewed, who I was lucky to interview a couple summers ago, in the summer of 2018, sorry, more than a couple summers, I guess, died of COVID-19 in March 2020. These men and women leave behind records that their spouses, children, or grandchildren are unsure of how to process and how to share. Many of the descendants are aware of the historical significance of these items, but they don't have the infrastructure, the money, or the technical knowledge to sort and archive them. I fear that we may lose more valuable documentation if scholars and institutions don't help with this colossal enterprise. My hope in ending this talk on the question of archives is to highlight that the Maghreb Noir, this book, is by no means a definitive history of Pan-Africanism in the post-colonial Maghreb. In particular, for example, Maghreb Noir deals very little with Amazigh activism, mainly for language reasons. I don't read or speak Amazigh, so that's a whole, that's a whole subject that could be tackled in a different book. But many more archives exist in people's attics, basements, and in their minds that I haven't been able to access. And I think it's our responsibility to find them. So for this, I'm seeking your support as scholars and researchers of the Maghreb. For this year's Middle East Studies Association annual meeting, I have organized a roundtable on archiving practices in the Maghreb. And my goal is to get a conversation started on how to conserve and make accessible post-colonial archives from the Maghreb, particularly those linking the Maghreb to Africa, because I think that's such an important history to conserve and to write. So if you're interested in this project, please feel free to email me or to come to the panel at Mesa if you do happen to be in Denver this year. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Paraska, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation and bringing to light. It's really good timing too, because you're finishing up, the book is going to be published, and this is just great. So let's see about Q&A. Somebody has a question here. And Samia, would you like to answer it directly, or would you like me to read the question?
Oh, you can read you can read the question, yeah. Let's see.
No, I was asking, so this is from Samia.
Okay.
And so I'll raise the question, but Samia, feel free to unmute if you want to follow up too. We have a small group here today, so we can have a nice interaction. So this was an insightful talk. Paraska, thank you. Very much looking forward to reading your book. My question is, do you come across any conversations, debates about the Western Saharan question during your research? And if so, what were the fault lines of these debates?
That's a very good question. I have come across some in Souffle, and partly potentially some of, and in Anfaz, some of the sort of complications that that the members of Souffle and Anfaz faced when they were imprisoned by the Moroccan state may have been due to articles that they wrote on the Western Sahara. It seems to me, you know, most of the period that I'm looking at in Morocco is sort of before major escalations. The War of the Sands between Algeria and Morocco figures quite prominently in my primary sources, mostly because the Angolans, the king actually believed that the Angolans and Mozambicans who were in Morocco were taking Algerian side in the War of the Sands, and so was not happy about that. But Amilcar Cabral wrote a letter to the king saying, no, we're not taking sides, but please resolve your issues with your Algerian brother, because we really need you to be friends so that we can continue fighting from both of these countries in the struggle for, you know, independence from Portugal. But so it seems that for the most part, but eventually, yeah, these militants did leave for Algeria and sort of favored Algeria over Morocco, as Hassan II, you know, sort of claimed, or, you know, became sort of turned towards Islam and turns towards more conservative African politics.
Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the roundtable at Mesa as well.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Samia. And here's another question from Carolyn. And Carolyn, again, if you want to follow up, you know, unmute yourself, we can make you a panelist so you can talk directly. But Carolyn says, this was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. When does the book come out? I would love to assign it for a class I'm teaching in the spring on Pan-Africanism.
Unfortunately, the book won't be out yet. It comes out July 11th, I think, 2023. But I'm happy, if you email me, I'm happy to send you some chapters if you'd like to assign them. Yeah.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's great. Is there another question or comment from anybody? And again, you can type your question in, or you can ask live, whichever you would prefer. In the meantime, we wait for more questions. I have one, if I might. Paraska and I were chatting a little bit before the webinar started, and I had shared with you that I taught English in Morocco in the 1980s, mid-1980s, and that my students, I was teaching English, were just fascinated with Bob Marley. And, you know, politically, I had to be sensitive in what songs I shared with them and teaching and so forth, but they were definitely interested in some of the radical revolutionary ideas. And so my question is, and I did help them understand those in English. It was very interesting. But I guess my question is, do you have any sense of sort of youth today and maybe current artists that are trying to kind of connect with the Maghreb Noir, you know, sort of movement, or is there anything sort of new or something? Because I think that it seemed to me, even in the 80s among the youth, there was definitely this sort of connection.
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is a connection. I mean, Black American music, American rap music, and hip hop are international in their appeal, I think. And certainly, I must say, I didn't hang out with a lot of very young or with people in their teens or early 20s when I was doing my research. I tended towards more old people because those were the people I was interviewing. So my relationship to the Maghreb might be a little skewed in terms of age. But I know that Hisham Aidi, I believe, has worked a little bit on like musical connections, or has a book on music rebels, on musical connections. I'm trying to remember if there's, but I'm sure he would, yeah, he has probably some idea of what kind of connections there are between like hip hop and American hip hop and North Africa. And yeah, I don't know, maybe somebody else can answer this question better than I can, honestly.
Anybody else have a thought?
I haven't read it yet, but Chris Silver's new book, Recording History, on music across North Africa. I'm not sure the extent to which that goes up to kind of the present day, but it's supposed to be a fantastic book. I like have it on my desk. I just haven't finished reading it yet.
Oh, okay. Fabulous. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks,
that.
I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would also add Mark Levine's work kind of speaks to this. I think more recently in light of sort of like the Arab Spring and its aftermath, and the ways in which North African rappers have been, disparaged because of their, emulation of, this outside culture and history. So recently, I think we've seen a lot of North African rappers facing incarceration for trumped up charges, the most recent of which has been El Gran Toto. But yeah, I guess, I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Samia. And I see Carolyn has put the link to the book in the chat.
Yeah, thank you
very
so
much. Yeah.
Me.
And I was thinking, my students, so at that time I was in my late 20s and my students were, 18, 19 years old, right? And I still think of them, all of us as being young, but that was in the 80s. So these would be people in their 50s now. And they, I had all the English, septième, sixième, septième année. I had all the students, and they were just so sort of taken with the reggae movement. So it's very interesting, but not able to really express it. They were very, careful about how they talked to me about it. But there was a sort of freedom about speaking about it in English, I think, since I was teaching them English and it was an English class. So I hadn't thought about that in years. Your talk has made me reflect on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there other questions or comments?
I guess just as sort of if you don't mind if I jump in.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so just kind of a general question. So I'm a PhD candidate right now, and I just got back from doing some field work in Tunisia, and I experienced that, it's a great place to do research, but it takes a little while to kind of get to know people well enough to get access to some of their personal papers and private archives. And I'm not sure what the situation is like in Morocco or Algeria, having not done research there. But just was wondering from, a practical advice standpoint for other researchers or, younger academics, what you'd recommend in terms of, building that trust and kind of getting access to have interviews or get access to some of these personal papers, because the archives that you've collected look absolutely amazing.
Thanks. Yeah. Honestly, that's one of the reasons I want to bring up the question of archives at Mesa this year, and we're having a roundtable with Samia. Is to talk about how to make post-colonial archives more accessible, because it did take a lot of time and it was difficult to find people. And as people are getting older, I think it's going to be more and more difficult. A lot of the people that I interviewed were in their late 60s, early 70s, late 70s, early 80s, on top of dealing with finding them and being able to email them. Some of them don't use email. I mean, I send a lot of letters, which I hadn't done in a long time. So that was that was complicated, and I want to make sure I want to share my archive digitally, but I also want to see if other people are willing to share it and put it together, because the state archives are basically inexistent in all three Maghrebi countries for the post-colonial period. Not as much in Tunis. There's the Centre de Documentation Nationale, which has some interesting stuff, but on the topic I was looking at, they didn't have that much. Honestly, I just called people, and then, they would put me in touch with their friends. It takes a while to build sort of the network, but people were very generous. I was always sort of surprised by how long, I would go to people's houses and they would talk to me for 3 hours and feed me and give me books and stuff to bring home. There was a lot of generosity.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. I think I kind of found the same thing. It's really hard to kind of get in touch with people at first, but once you do, yeah, they're always feeding you and inviting you back for tea. And
yeah.
So very helpful. Thank you.
And I could sense that some people had like a specific idea that they wanted to, one person in particular in Algeria really wanted me to get like one specific message. So sometimes the motivation was, for the historical record to be written in a certain way. So that's also something to pay attention to, obviously. Yeah.
I had another question, sort of, I guess, building off of the work that Mshouk Elham has done with Black Morocco. And you spoke a little bit about, the folks distinguishing themselves from like white European, and like the Beat generation coming from San Francisco and stuff. But did you come across any sort of racial tensions between the Maghrebis and, Black writers who, had some recognition, understanding of this like genealogy and history of, anti-Blackness and racialized slavery that took place between North and West Africa? I mean, I'm thinking about Morocco's invasion of the Songhai in 1591, which is very niche for me, but sort of the afterlives of that. I mean, did that come up at all?
Yeah, so it's something that, comes up throughout the book, and particularly my 4th chapter where I talk about like romantic and sexual encounters. I found that people were very, my interviewees were very reluctant to acknowledge racial prejudice or, any racial tensions. Because I think, many of them were very nostalgic for this time period in Africa that they saw as rosier and nicer, and for these collaborations. But when they started talking about sex, a lot of their sort of their like reserve fell away. And that's where I saw a lot of sort of stereotypes and prejudices come out. So that's sort of the 4th chapter, the relationships between Black men who were coming and Algerian women, and then between Black women and Algerian men. That's where I sort of saw the most racial underpinnings, or the most racial language. But certainly even, in my analysis of Souffle, I talk about Souffle's very sort of aggressive reaction of the negritude movement, which is not the same. Most of the actors of the Maghreb generation rejected negritude as sort of a passé ideology, but many of the Black members saw sort of what negritude had allowed them to get. They saw it as like a passage towards where they were, this sort of revolutionary Frantz Fanonian stage that they were in now. Whereas the members of Souf really sort of mocked negritude in a way that many of their Black peers did not. So, I see that as there was some condescension at some points in Souf, so towards like African countries that had, I think Labi at one point says they didn't have a culture before the arrival of the Europeans, or their culture, there's definitely some problematic language there, or some, yeah.
Wow, that's super interesting. I'm really excited to read this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samia.
Paraska, can I ask where your research might go in the future?
Yeah, well, I'm just starting to think about, or, I have been thinking about this for a while. I still need to do a lot of the background reading, but I really want to write, this is the first time I'm going to talk about it actually, a lesbian history of the Maghreb. And part of that is because when I was in North Africa, I spent a lot of time in different like queer communities. And I've noticed that when people write about queerness in the Maghreb, it's almost, or when very few people have written about queer identity in the Maghreb. And when they do, it's almost always from the perspective of gay men. And with the recent publication of Fatima Dass's La Petite Dernière, there was sort of a debate, at least in France, between like, can you be a good Muslim and can you be gay? And she received a lot of ire from the gay community for saying that she thought being gay was a sin. So there's been sort of this dichotomy between Islam and queerness. And I think that if I sort of want to do an oral history of the sort of the post-colonial period and the struggles. And I know that in Tunisia, there were, emergences of this struggle during the Tunisian revolution that have been since sort of tamped down. But yeah, this will involve me spending a lot more time in North Africa, which I'm excited about. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And it's making me think about Fatima Mernissi, who I met in the 1980s.
Oh, you met her? Oh,
yeah,
cool.
I did. She came and did a wonderful sort of cross-cultural training for our group of Peace Corps volunteers. And, I followed her work and so forth for my own dissertation. But I wonder if there's, she's sadly no longer with us, but I wonder if there's some interesting undercurrents in some of her work.
Yeah, I'll definitely be looking towards her. And, some Moroccan writers have like queer characters, mostly men, though I think Tahar Ben Jelloun's L'Enfant Sable has a trans character. So there's some sort of queer characters in literature. But yeah, it's definitely
L'Enfant de Sable. Is that the
L'Enfant de Sable? Yeah.
Yeah, I read that so many years ago. Yeah.
And there's also Nina Bouraoui, Le Garçon Manqué.
Le Garçon Manqué.
Garçon Manqué.
Yeah, that was a great one. But then I'm also thinking about there's a lot of sort of like queer undertones in the music of Cheikh Harmiti as well.
Will you send these things to me, Samia?
These are just, I'm like just inspired by this topic, like as like a queer identifying Maghrebi woman. So I'm just like, yes. But
well, yeah, that's one of the things. And you can tell me if I, as a non-Maghrebi person, but also queer, I feel like maybe this is a position in which, doing an oral history, but not being from the Maghreb would, sort of protect, potential social issues for some, for a Maghrebi historian who did this kind of thing, or I don't know if,
we could definitely talk more about it in Mesa. And then there's also recently at the International Book Festival in Rabat, they censored and banned I think it was like a graphic novel written by a Moroccan lesbian.
Oh, I know that. I think I know that graphic novel. What was it called? Yeah,
the name escapes me right now. But yeah, we'll definitely chat about this.
Yeah, let's talk about this.
Sounds like some interesting collaboration will take place at Mesa. That's great. Yeah. That's great. And that's what these talks are for too, so you share ideas and we inspire each other and and you're really, you're publishing your work from your dissertation. And so you're kind of an exciting point where you can decide, okay, what am I going to do next?
Yeah, I'm excited to move on to the next thing, honestly.
That's really great. Yeah. Are there more comments? Skylar, did you want to ask something?
Yes, I was actually really curious. You mentioned a little bit, Paraska, about the Amazigh and not being super comfortable with the sources, but that just got me thinking more kind of also in line with Mary Jane's questions about the contemporary moment of just the kind of awareness for the uncovery of these histories in the contemporary moment. We obviously talked a little bit about kind of institutional memory, that quote that you mentioned from the conference at the Royal Archive in Morocco. But I'm just curious on kind of a different level, just at a cultural level, how much you might have, as you were traveling through, is there a cultural willingness? I don't want to put like a Gen Z label or something like that, but is there something coming up that is an awareness in uncovering this? Do you think that's growing? Do you think that's diminishing?
Of Amazigh identity?
Oh, I guess just essentially kind of uncovering these histories, specifically around Pan-Africanism, specifically around the role of kind of Blackness and these racial contentions that were being played out in some senses within the Maghreb.
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is, particularly because I think the Black populations, and especially in Tunisia, but like also in Morocco and Algeria, have been really, they're resisting and they're fighting for their place in sort of, what the leaders constructed as homogenous nations, but are definitely not homogenous. And that's also, this connects to my idea of doing a lesbian history of the Maghreb, is also like the idea of Moroccan nation or the Maghrebi nations as homogenous was so top down. This is Bourguiba's idea, was like a way of quelling any sort of dissent, but really quieted like any voices of dissent, whether they were Pan-African, Black, whether they were queer. So I think that there absolutely is like a pushback, and still is to, people like Mati Monjib and Rabat, like people who like have been imprisoned or, are pushing back. But Amazigh voices specifically, I know a lot of scholars who've been starting to talk, or, Brahim El-Galbi, Gabli is working on Amazigh issues and has like written a lot for Jadaliya and Amazigh issues, and certainly scholars of like Maghrebi scholars have been a big part of like pushing against this idea of a homogenous Morocco or homogenous Algeria or Tunisia. Yeah, and are activists too, which is cool to see. Yeah.
On that note, I actually just added a link to the chat of Brahim's recent publication with the
Amazigh
review books, just came out this morning, so really relevant to this.
Thank you very much, Samia.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and he just started the Tamazagh Studies Journal, which is, well, he and other scholars, Omar Boum and I never know how to pronounce her last name, Katrina Piperzanak, I think, or who's a Williams, started this like a Tamazagh Studies Journal, which is sort of a study of Amazigh identity and multilingual Maghreb from Egypt to the sea, to the Atlantic. So it's a broad understanding of the Maghreb and a multilingual understanding of the Maghreb. And I think that they're determined on training graduate students and scholars who actually use Amazigh, Tamazigh, and yeah, which I think is great. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I can reflect on my experiences living in Morocco in the 80s and then spending a lot of time there in the recent 2000s. And, I would always get commentary in the 80s on, oh my goodness, you speak, Darija, you speak, Moroccan Arabic, not just French. And that was it, Darija. And now it's always, you speak Darija and Amazigh, Tashal Haid, and that's so interesting. I mean, it's such a big, of course, that, it's no longer banned, and we know why, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's great.
So we're just about at 1 o'clock, so I think we can officially thank Paraska for this wonderful presentation and discussion that followed. Really fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we can.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for your comments and questions.